For nearly 70 years, the people of Rowan County, Kentucky, whispered about a man whose name was scratched out of ledgers, burned from church records, and erased from census books as if he had never existed. Elijah Anderson. In the spring of 1847, 3 entire slave families disappeared in a single night. No blood, no footprints, no broken locks, only cold hearths and unfinished prayers left behind. The plantation owner reported them as lost property. The local pastor called it divine intervention, and the state archive, quietly, sealed the investigation. What no one noticed at the time was that every disappearance followed the same pattern. A sermon, a hymn sung too slowly, and a tall man standing at the back of the church, eyes lowered, lips never moving. Yet everyone somehow heard him speak. By the time federal marshals arrived months later, Elijah Anderson was already gone, or so the records claim. But buried inside a condemned seminary basement, beneath warped hymnals and insect-eaten Bibles, there exists a handwritten journal that begins with a warning. If this book is found, burn it. If it is read, you will understand why they tried to erase me. Tonight, we open that book, and what it reveals is not a story of escape, but of control, faith turned into chains, and a man who learned how to lead people out of bondage by first walking them into terror. Elijah Anderson was born sometime around 1819, though no birth record confirms it. The only evidence of his existence comes from plantation supply logs, where his name appears beside tools, livestock, and iron nails. He was listed as quiet, then later, dangerously observant. From childhood, Elijah did not cry, not when beaten, not when separated from his mother, not even when forced to watch public punishments meant to terrify others into obedience. Instead, he watched. Overseers reported that he stared too long, that he seemed to count things, steps, breaths, the number of times a whip struck flesh. One journal entry by a plantation clerk reads, "The boy listens as though God himself is whispering instructions." By the age of 12, Elijah was assigned to assist the plantation's traveling preacher, a man who believed Scripture could be weaponized. Elijah was taught to read the Bible aloud, not to understand it, but to deliver it with authority. Something went wrong. Elijah did not read Scripture as written. He paused in places that made listeners uncomfortable. He emphasized words that sounded like warnings rather than promises. Enslaved people began gathering not for sermons, but for Elijah. He never told them to run, never spoke of rebellion. He only asked one question, again and again. If God hears everything, why does he never answer the men who own you? That question spread faster than fire, and the institutions built on obedience began to notice. By 1843, Elijah was transferred to a rural church in eastern Kentucky, a place known for reforming difficult slaves through Scripture. The church sat on land older than the town itself. Local legend claimed it had been built over a burial ground no one spoke about. Every Sunday, Elijah stood silently at the back while white pastors preached submission. Yet afterward, enslaved families claimed they felt different. Sleep became shallow. Dreams became shared. Multiple people reported seeing the same vision, a river at night, moving backward, carrying people away from chains instead of toward them. Elijah never confirmed these stories. He never denied them either. What terrified church leaders wasn't rebellion, it was coordination. Families began arriving at church already knowing what hymn would be sung. Children repeated scripture Elijah had never read aloud. And when questioned, they all gave the same answer. He told us without speaking. The pastor wrote to the state seminary, requesting Elijah's removal. The reply came weeks later, stamped urgent. Do not relocate. Observe. Because by then, officials believed Elijah wasn't just influencing people. They believed he was organizing them into something quieter than an uprising, something that looked like faith. On April 11, 1847, Elijah was scheduled to be sold south, a permanent removal. That night, the church held a farewell prayer. It was raining. Witnesses later testified that Elijah asked to read one final passage. The pastor agreed, confident no harm could come from words already sanctified. Elijah read from Exodus, but stopped halfway through. He closed the Bible, and for the first time in his life, he spoke without scripture. Tonight, he said, the river will remember its original direction. At midnight, guards reported hearing singing, not from the church, but from the water. By morning, 3 families were gone. Search parties followed the riverbank for miles. No tracks, no boats, no bodies. The river itself had turned unusually dark, as if stirred from below. That same morning, Elijah Anderson was missing. The church bell was found cracked down the middle, and inside the pulpit drawer, officials discovered a single sentence carved into the wood. "You taught us God watches. You never asked what he remembers." What followed was not pursuit. It was deletion. Elijah's name was removed from sermons, records, and sale documents. Pastors were instructed to deny he ever preached. Plantation owners received compensation for losses not to be discussed. Even abolitionist papers never mentioned him. Because Elijah Anderson represented something far more dangerous than escape. He proved that faith, when reclaimed, could dismantle control without violence. And institutions cannot survive that. Yet fragments remain. A hymn altered slightly in eastern Kentucky churches. A river bend locals refused to fish near. And a recurring phrase carved into orphanage walls decades later. "We are still walking." In the next section, we uncover where Elijah didn't flee, but where he may have led them. In 1892, a railroad surveyor named Thomas Bell documented something impossible while charting routes through eastern Kentucky. Hidden between official land deeds, he discovered a hand-drawn map folded inside a Bible abandoned in a collapsed schoolhouse. The map did not show property lines. It showed paths, curving routes through forests, across rivers, around towns, but never into them. Each path ended at the same symbol. A simple vertical line crossed once. A staff. Bell noted something else that unsettled him deeply. Every path avoided churches. Not just plantations, churches. When Bell asked locals about the map's markings, an elderly woman reportedly whispered, "Those are the quiet roads. The ones Elijah taught them to walk." Bell attempted to submit the map to state historians. The document vanished before review. Bell himself was later declared mentally unstable and dismissed from service. But before his dismissal, Bell added a final note to his journal. "These routes are not for escape. They are for disappearance." The question no one wanted to ask was simple. If Elijah Anderson didn't lead people north, where did he lead them instead? In the decades after Elijah vanished, orphanages began appearing along Kentucky's eastern ridges, quiet institutions sponsored by churches, meant to save lost souls. But inspectors noticed something disturbing. Children from different orphanages, miles apart, sang the same hymns with identical pauses. They emphasized the same words Elijah once emphasized. Even stranger, some children who could not read recited entire passages of Scripture, verses never taught to them. When asked where they learned them, the children replied calmly, "The tall man visits at night." Church officials dismissed this as imagination, until one orphanage caretaker recorded a detail she could not explain. The children never described Elijah as frightening. They described him as patient. "He listens until we remember who we were before they renamed us." That phrase, "before they renamed us," appears again and again in orphanage reports, often scratched out or blacked over. Because names are ownership, and Elijah taught children to remember the ones taken from them. In 1911, a seminary outside Moorhead, Kentucky was quietly closed due to structural instability. The official report cited sinking foundations. The real reason lay underneath. During demolition, workers discovered a sealed lower level not included in original blueprints. Inside were pews carved directly into stone, and walls etched with scripture rewritten by hand. Not erased, corrected. Passages emphasizing obedience were crossed through. Verses about liberation were circled again and again. And beneath the altar, engraved deeply into limestone, were 3 words: "He still walks." What terrified investigators most was not the room, but the dates carved beside each passage. They extended decades beyond Elijah's disappearance. Someone had been teaching there, someone continuing his work. The seminary records were sealed. The building was destroyed. The hill was rebelist, but the soil never stopped shifting. By the early 20th century, slavery was legally abolished, but something else had taken its place. Control through dependency. Control through silence. Control through faith distorted into obedience. And Elijah's influence adapted. Former slaves' descendants reported a pattern. Elders who refused church authority, yet quoted scripture flawlessly. Families who avoided towns entirely, living between jurisdictions. Always near water. Always near old paths. One federal agent investigating unregistered communities wrote, "These people do not resist. They simply cannot be found. No rebellion. No protests. Just absence." It was as if Elijah had taught generations not how to fight institutions, but how to outlive them. And institutions hate nothing more than irrelevance. In 1936, a letter arrived at the Kentucky State Archives with no return address. Inside was a single sheet, written in a careful, deliberate hand. "You will keep searching for bodies. You will keep finding none, because we were never meant to be martyrs." The letter ended with a signature that archivists insisted could not be authentic. Elijah Anderson. Handwriting analysis was never completed. The letter was filed under unverified folklore. But one archivist later confessed that when she touched the paper, she felt an overwhelming sensation, not fear, but recognition. As if someone had been waiting for her to remember something important, something unfinished. In 1902, representatives from 5 Kentucky religious institutions gathered for what official records describe as a regional doctrinal alignment. No minutes were recorded. No agenda survives. Yet afterward, something changed. Sermons across eastern Kentucky began sounding identical. Certain verses disappeared entirely. Others were shortened, stripped of metaphor, drained of meaning. Pastors were instructed to emphasize order over salvation, obedience over mercy. Privately, one clergyman wrote, "We are no longer preaching God. We are preaching containment." What terrified church leaders was not Elijah's disappearance, but his endurance. Decades had passed, yet people still followed paths he never wrote down. Children still knew hymns altered in his cadence. Communities still existed beyond institutional reach. The meeting's unspoken conclusion was simple. Elijah Anderson was no longer a man. He was a method, and methods must be dismantled at the source. Beginning in 1905, orphanages across Kentucky received new directives. Children without documented parentage were to be relocated immediately. Siblings were separated. Names were reassigned. And one specific instruction appeared repeatedly in administrative notes. Remove children who demonstrate independent scriptural interpretation. Those children were described as calm, observant, difficult to discipline, not because they resisted, but because punishment did nothing. Caretakers noted something chilling. These children did not fear abandonment. They behaved as if someone would come for them eventually. One orphanage ledger contains a margin note written shakily in pencil. They say the man promised, "No one who remembers their name stays lost forever." That orphanage burned down 3 months later. Cause, undetermined. Between 1918 and 1924, doctors in rural Kentucky recorded a phenomenon they could not explain. Unrelated patients, different ages, races, and backgrounds, reported identical recurring dreams. A river flowing backward. A voice speaking without sound. A command not to follow, but to wait. Medical journals dismissed it as stress or trauma, superstition. But one physician wrote privately, "These dreams are instructional. They do not comfort. They prepare." In every account, the dream ended the same way. The dreamer stood at the edge of the river. Someone unseen placed a hand on their shoulder, and a sentence formed in their mind. Not yet, as if escape itself was being carefully timed. By the 1930s, officials believed Elijah's influence had finally faded. Records were clean. Institutions stabilized. Church attendance normalized. Then a flood exposed something buried beneath a collapsed riverside chapel. Stone markers, unmarked, unnamed, arranged not as graves, but as stations. Each stone bore a carved symbol, the cross staff from Bell's map. These were not burial sites. They were gathering points, places where people had waited. The implication was unbearable. Elijah had not led a single exodus. He had designed many. A linguist studying recovered documents noticed something overlooked for nearly a century. Elijah Anderson did not follow regional naming patterns. It was constructed. Biblical first name, common surname, a name easy to erase, easy to deny, easy to replace, which raised the most unsettling possibility of all. Elijah Anderson may not have been one person. He may have been the first. A role passed quietly, patiently, from one to another, never commanding, never ruling, only reminding people how to listen. And if that was true, then the institutions never destroyed Elijah Anderson. They only misunderstood what they were fighting. By the 1940s, surveyors noticed something deeply unsettling. The old paths, those drawn on Bell's vanished map, no longer aligned with modern roads or property lines. Yet people continued to travel them, even when no trail was visible. Locals claimed the paths shifted, not physically, but socially. Where a road once passed through a town, the town moved. Where a church once stood, it closed. Where authority gathered, the paths curved away. Elijah's method was not escape from geography. It was escape from systems. A retired marshal wrote, "You cannot chase people who are no longer where you expect humans to be." The paths were not routes. They were instructions for how to exist without being contained. In 1948, a minister preparing a sermon in eastern Kentucky discovered a handwritten page inside a donated Bible. The handwriting matched the 1936 archive letter. The page contained no scripture, only guidance. Do not gather crowds. Crowds attract cages. Teach one at a time. Teach them to listen. The minister never delivered the sermon. Instead, he resigned abruptly, moved near the river, and refused formal religious titles for the rest of his life. Instead, he resigned abruptly, moved near the river, and refused formal religious titles for the rest of his life. Neighbors later described him as peaceful, unreachable, as if he had stepped sideways out of expectation. History remembers resistance through violence because violence leaves records. Elijah left none. No battles, no speeches, no bodies. He understood something institutions depend on. Oppression requires visibility. By removing himself, and those who followed, from documentation, Elijah made control impossible. One historian summarized it best. They didn't win. They simply refused to be counted. And that is why there are no statues, no holidays, no lessons taught, because you cannot memorialize what never surrendered. In several Kentucky churches, hymn books printed between 1920 and 1950 contain a typographical anomaly. The first letter of certain hymns, read vertically, spells a sentence. WEARESTILLWALKING. Publishers claimed coincidence. But the message appeared across multiple editions, from different presses. Someone was coordinating. Quietly, patiently, just as Elijah taught. Today, if you visit eastern Kentucky, you may notice places where cell service fades without explanation, where rivers feel watched, where people avoid certain questions, not out of fear, but respect. Elijah Anderson is not remembered because remembrance was never the goal. Survival was. And if this story feels unfinished, that is because it is. Somewhere, someone is listening more than speaking, teaching without preaching, walking without leaving tracks. And as long as institutions depend on obedience, Elijah Anderson will never be gone.